Welcome to this week's webinar of the Consumer Choice Center. We have a very international topic, an international global audience and global speakers panelists today. My name is Fred Roeder. I'm Managing Director of the Consumer Choice Center. Today, calling in or broadcasting from London, United Kingdom, hopefully with stable internet. Lockdown got us all working from home, and many of us seem to have troubles with a stable internet connection. Therefore, we also thought it's a good time to discuss the topic of the 5th generation mobile phone standard, 5G, which is a global discussion. There definitely have been many news stories about it in the last couple of years. It started becoming parts of trade wars, health policy, local civil society, activism in favor and against 5G. And we just want to today discuss how we can use 5G to split more people. It also mean that that we need more stable internet connections. I just got to pop that my internet connection is unstable from Zoom. So we have the great honor to have the Commissioner of the FCC, Brendan Carr of the Federal Communications Commission of the United States with us. The FCC is the government body in the United States being in charge of regulating and overseeing telecommunications infrastructure and technology. To say it very simple, Commissioner Carr can explain this in more detail. Commissioner Carr started as a private sector attorney in telecommunications at the law firm Wiley & Rain, then joined the FCC, was its general counsel, aide to the FCC member Ajit Pai, and now he serves as the commissioner. Brendan Carr is also not the typical bureaucrat, but he's extremely active on social media. He travels through the country and through the world, promoting innovations in telecommunications and smart regulation. And our second panelist from Sweden is Mattias Karlsson. He's a Swedish politician. Until very recently, he was leader of the Swedish Democrats in the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag. And he's still a member of parliament and now heads a newly found think tank called Oikos. We got a couple of social media interactions already just promoting this webinar, talking about 5G. And we could really see it's a topic that polarizes people. While, for instance, I personally see 5G as something I want to have very quickly because I love fast connection. I also see other people and even municipalities and countries being very hesitant towards 5G. We could even fake news stories about 5G accelerating the spread of COVID-19 because potentially this virus can travel faster on the airwaves of 5G. Commissioner Carr, maybe in a couple of minutes, tell us a bit more about what is the 5G project, why is it so, why is it polarizing people so much, and where do we have the biggest challenges coming up?
Well, thank you so much. It's great to join you all again. Matthias, great to see you and join you virtually for this event. Look forward to your remarks very much. You know, 5G is something we're really excited about here in the US. I think the best way to think about it is that 5G is going to be the economic platform of the future. So many new innovations and jobs are going to be created on that platform. And the best way to put it in context, I think, is to ask people to think back on their own life 10 years ago. And this is when we were shifting from 3G to 4G. So as one example, think about how you used to get across town 10 years ago. You know, you had to stand in a taxi line or call a taxi, pay exorbitant rates. Think about all those trips that you just didn't bother taking because there was too much hassle. Well, when 4G came online, that is what unlocked the entire app economy. So now you have Uber, Lyft, Blacklane, Via, you know, right on your phone. And so it revolutionized how we get across town. Or think about your own life in terms of banking. It used to be that to change money, you'd have to go to a brick and mortar store. You'd have to stand in line with those little rope lines. You'd have to use that pen to fill out a check, and the pen was leashed to the table and it was always out of ink. And now you have Square, Venmo, and other money transfer apps right on your 4G enabled smartphone. So many pain points in our daily lives 10 years ago that you may not even have identified as a pain point has been eliminated because of 4G. And we're going to see that exact same thing happen again. Very few people could have predicted the app economy when we were shifting from 3G to 4G. And a lot of people are struggling with some vision about what 5G is going to enable. So I think of it in a few ways. One, it's going to be everything you can do on your phone today much, much faster. In a lot of ways, that is the least interesting part of 5G because 4G phones are already pretty fast. The second bucket is I think of it as high-speed home internet. So many Americans where I live and people around the world feel like they have one or no choice for high-speed home internet services. Well, now with 5G, that's a technology that for the first time can actually compete with cable or compete with fiber to deliver high-speed internet right to someone's home. So you're gonna get more choice, more competition for in-home broadband. I think that's gonna be something that consumers really are gonna love. And finally, you know, I think about it as this third bucket of all of these next generation innovations. So think about connected cars. Well, 5G is the upgrade to the network that we need to enable that. The Internet of Things, virtual reality. We have to upgrade our wireless networks to enable those innovations. And in terms of virtual reality, I think that's gonna be an interesting use case for 5G. So for instance, right now, you know, I've never really enjoyed going to the grocery store, but I have to eat. So therefore I have to go to the grocery store. Right now with COVID, it's even more of a challenge, obviously, because we're trying to social distance. And there's some online apps right now where you can go online and order food, but it's never really made a lot of sense to me because it doesn't replicate that same experience of going into your local grocery store. So imagine now with a 5G network, you can put on virtual reality goggles, sit on your couch at home, and you can walk virtually down not just any grocery store, but your actual grocery store aisle. So, you know, I'm picky. I like to go a certain route. I like to know where things are in my store. So you can do that now. And then with haptics, you can pick up a piece of fruit and feel it and see, do I want this? And you can just virtually plop these in your grocery cart and they can be delivered, no contact, none of the pain of having to leave your house to do that. So there's pain points in your daily life today that you may not even recognize as a pain point, but there are gonna be innovations that ride on this 5G platform that are gonna enable it. So there's a lot of challenges between getting where we are and getting there. And we've been taking them on systematically in the US. One is spectrum. You need a lot more of the airwaves to enable these new innovations. And so we've been working through the spectrum bands, freeing up spectrum everywhere we can. And you know, there's always going to be a tug of war as you do that between incumbents or nearby incumbents and trying to free up spectrum. But we've been doing that pretty systematically. The other thing is infrastructure. So we in the US and our counterparts in Europe have infrastructure rules that made a lot of sense maybe for building out new 300-foot tall towers. But those rules didn't make sense when you talk about the type of build that you need for 5G. And what we talk about for 5G is largely this densifying of the network. So where you had one big cell tower before, now you may have 10 smaller cell towers filling in and built in within that footprint. Making each of those small cells go through the same regulatory hoops that you did for a new 300-foot tower not only didn't make sense, but it was holding back 5G builds and limiting it to only the most densely populated affluent communities. So we've taken action at the FCC to eliminate the red tape and the permitting costs that come from building out 5G internet infrastructure. And that work has been paying off really in spades. We've had a real big increase in small cell builds in the US. In 2017, I think there was something like 13,000. In 2018, there was something like 60,000 that went in. By the end of last year, we had a total installed base of something like 200,000. So it's a real good success story in the US right now. Internet speeds are up about 85% since December 2016. More miles of high-speed fiber, because again, we talk about these cell sites, but these cell sites have to be connected to the internet themselves. And a lot of that is fiber and other high-speed connections. So more miles of high-speed fiber were built out in the US last year than ever before. Something like 450,000 route miles went in. More homes were passed with high-speed fiber than ever before. So we engaged in some pretty significant reforms and the results are pouring in, and that's great. One other challenge that we see is one that you touched on, which is, you know, there's a lot of this conspiracy theories or that come from the darkest depths of tinfoil hat land about 5G. And to some extent, none of that is new. Look, we saw that with 3G, we saw it with 4G, heck, we saw it 100 years ago when FM and AM radio waves were first being used. The same type of conspiracy theories were going around then. The difference now is we have social media, so they're amplified and can move a bit faster. But look, we have experts, scientists, epidemiologists that look at the science and the radiation coming from 4G, 5G, all RF emitting devices. And they've looked at dozens and dozens of different studies, and they all reach the same bottom line, that these emissions are safe. And in fact, we've seen evidence that state actors, Russia in particular, has been behind some of these conspiracy theories because Russia's falling behind the US, Europe, and other communities in terms of 5G builds. So they're trying to sow disinformation about 5G and health effects purely to slow down the builds. And obviously this spike with COVID is just, obviously it's wrong on so many levels. Look, when you look at how COVID is spreading around the world and you look at the pattern of 5G cell sites, there's absolutely no correlation. When you look at brain cancer and other nervous system cancers, there's been a slight decrease in the US since 1987. And over that same time when brain cancer and other nervous system cancers have been decreasing, cell phone usage obviously has spiked like a hockey stick. So that is a real world, disproving of the same tired 100-year-old conspiracy theories that we've always seen. So we're excited. We got to keep pushing forward, and consumers are really going to benefit from this technology.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Carr, for this very interesting intro. Matthias Karlsson, you're from Sweden, a country with a bit more than 10 million population, but it takes 12 hours to drive from the most southern to the most northern part of Sweden. And many parts of Sweden have a very low population density. And I can just assume, without knowing Swedish domestic politics too much, I can only assume that connecting rural areas with fast internet is a topic. Sweden is one of the technology leaders, together with Finland, in Europe when it comes to mobile phone network technology. So maybe what is the general view of you and the situation in Sweden when it comes to connecting people to faster means of communication?
Yeah, thank you, Fred. I'm really honored to be invited, and especially in such a distinguished company as Commissioner Carr. Unlike Commissioner Carr, I'm not an expert in 5G, but I can give you my perspective as a parliamentarian, a Swede, and a conservative. And I think in general, my view on 5G, it could be pretty well summarized with a quote from my favorite philosopher, Roger Scruton, conservative philosopher. He said that the conservative response to modernity and progress is to embrace it, but to embrace it with caution, in full consciousness that human achievements are rare and precarious. And I think the embracing part is that I see this as a very, very positive step. I think it's going to revolutionize large parts of society to its core. I think it's going to help us increase productivity in many sectors. I think it's going to be beneficial to consumers in many different ways. And I'm very proud also that a Swedish company, Ericsson, is in the front line of this development. It makes me proud as a Swede. And like you touched upon, Sweden is a densely populated but very vast country, and we have areas, especially in the north, who suffers problems like depopulation, bad connection to internet and so forth. And I think that 5G can have a very positive impact on those areas, not only in Sweden but other similar parts of Europe. I think it's going to make it easier to work from home. I think it's going to be easier to get an education online and connect people in a better way, and also help consumers in these kind of areas. So I think that's great, and I'm really looking forward to this step. And I see it as my responsibility as a parliamentarian to try to facilitate this change as much as possible, because I think it's going to be beneficial to not just my country and my society, but also all of Europe and also the world. But like the quote said, I think we also need to be a little bit cautious whilst embracing progress and modernity. And there are a few things that I think that we need to be cautious about when it comes to 5G. One of them is that I think that we're going to see an increase in jobless growth. And that is in some ways very good because it increases productivity. But as a politician, I think I have an invested interest in trying to keep social cohesion make people feel that they're a part of something bigger. And so I think we need, as politicians, need to plan for this. How to take care of the people who are now have job in traditional industries, taxi drivers and others that could be affected of 5G, or probably will be, and try to make this restructuring of society as smooth as possible. I think that 5G could be very positive in that process as well. Like I said, I think education will be more accessible. I think that could help retrain and reskill people who get laid off in different sectors. It shouldn't be a problem if we plan ahead and are smart about it. But I think it's something that we as politicians need to keep in mind. My greatest concern at the moment is the situation with China and the risks that we are seeing in regards to that, and especially Huawei and the fact that large parts of Europe are now going to be dependent on a Chinese company to take this step to 5G. And normally I'm free trade. I think that we should just make deals with the ones who offer us the best deal. But the situation with Huawei in China makes this very, very complicated. We are facing a completely new situation because we have a situation where by law, all Chinese companies, all Chinese citizens are obliged to be a tool to the Chinese Communist Party and to the Chinese Communist Party intelligence service. And given the fact that so much sensitive information is going to go through this 5G technology, and if it end up in the wrong hands, or people want to take advantage of the opportunities that this gives you as a provider of 5G, that could pose a very, very serious threat to the security of my country, but also other countries in Europe. And we're seeing how Huawei are not acting like a normal company. We have seen many incidents where people connected to Huawei have been arrested for attempted espionage. We are seeing how the whole Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party are blackmailing countries into using Huawei's solution. The latest example was the small nation of the Faroese Islands, so very close to me geographically and also close to my heart. They are going to impose now 5G, and China is trying to blackmail them to choose Huawei. If they don't, they will lose a lot of their income from fishery. And that shows also the danger of making yourself dependent on China. And I think China is in many ways an interesting market, but it is very problematic to make yourself dependent on China, because they're going to use that dependency to try to blackmail you and to limit your freedom. And that is very, very problematic for everyone. It's problematic for us who supports free trade, democracy and freedom, because they are disturbing the whole way we think about, free trade and market values.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Yes, that's a lot of information to digest. It's definitely concerning how sometimes diplomacy is being made with trade. One just very recent example was Australia asking for an independent investigation and China's and the WHO's role in the spread of COVID and the lack of information being provided. And suddenly import tariffs on Australian coal were imposed by China, and some of the more high quality coal being used in China is actually Australian coal, and for Australia it's a major export market. So two absolutely not connected issues are suddenly being made dependent on each other, upon each other. Probably really interesting to see with 5G is the topic, if you think how expensive a rent for a young professional in Stockholm or San Francisco or New York is. And most of the good employers and high paying salaries are in these cities, but usually at the end of your paycheck, and after you paid your rent, not much is left, or your mortgage payment. And fast nationwide internet connections can definitely be a game changer to decentralize the allocation of highly paid, highly qualified jobs and just make it easier for people to start buying a house and living somewhere where the living costs are not insanely high. So that is a great opportunity. Something we saw while promoting the webinar was that we got some comment some data and promotion materials. I just want to read out loud just to show what sort of misinformation sometimes is in the room about 5G. So this is Facebook now, I believe. Someone said, is 5G kills? There is proof, Google it. 5G and not COVID-19 is the real pandemic, and 5G is a slow death sentence. And I'm back. So what we can see is that there is definitely some campaign against rolling out 5G. This campaign seems to have been intensified since some countries consciously decided to value cybersecurity and their citizens and corporate companies' privacy, and going against implementing technologies, both hard and software, coming from communist China. But probably, as the New York Times also, I believe, wrote, parts of this might also come from some authoritarian governments that feel that they're lagging behind with this technology, so they want to deprive everyone else from this technology as well. But Commissioner Carr, the United States were probably the first liberal democracy that made very big steps towards consumer privacy in an era of 5G. So maybe you can outline a bit what the FCC and the US government did in order to incentivize the rollout of 5G, but at the same time allowing consumers and businesses trusting in the technology in terms of privacy.
Yeah, thanks a lot there. I mean, I touched earlier a little bit on some of this, health and safety conspiracy theories that are out there. And as I remarked, I mean, look, there's nothing new to this. We were going to die from AM and FM radio signals back in the 1920s. We were going to die from the 2G and 3G rollouts in the early 2000s, and we were going to die a third or fourth death, depending how you count, now that 5G has been rolled out. Look, there are expert epidemiologists, scientists. They are constantly reviewing the evidence. And those studies, the bottom line is that there are no adverse health effects from lawful RF emissions. And what you see is people pluck pieces out of existing studies. Most principally what we see is there's this one study called the NTP study, the National Toxicology Program here in the US. And they cite that study as evidence that there is some connection between RF emissions and cancer or other health instances. And that's not at all what the study says. If you look at the study, it exposed lab rats to RF emissions up to 75 times higher than what humans experience from cell phone systems. And then they purported to show some results at that level, but if you pick at the data, even just a little bit, there's a lot of anomalies in that particular study. But anyways, even just taking the 75 number, that's like taking a lab rat, tossing it off a 75-story building, and using the result of that to say that humans shouldn't jump rope. There is simply no connection between, there's no established connection between the exposure that humans have from RF emissions, whether their phone or the towers, and adverse health effects, as dozens and dozens and dozens of studies have shown. But look, there are a handful of people, maybe more, for which the facts just don't matter. The truth just doesn't matter. They are going to buy this conspiracy theory hook, line, and sinker. There's lots of emotional reasons why people want to and buy into conspiracy theories. I'm not here to try to dislodge those people from them. They are welcome to their conspiracy theories. But for everyone else that does care about the truth and the facts, to borrow a phrase, the truth is out there, and it's that these emissions are safe. But look, we've done a lot here. We've, as I mentioned, freed up spectrum. We have been working on permitting to make this stuff roll out faster. In fact, we're voting in 2 weeks at the FCC on what I call the 5G upgrade order. So this is a decision that would take existing cell sites and make it easier and faster for providers to swap out 4G antennas for 5G antennas, to add another set of 5G antennas for more competition. And that's going to be particularly helpful in rural parts of our country. The US has an interesting geography, I think, unlike basically every other country except maybe Australia in terms of population density. One of the advantages that Europe has is it tends to be very densely populated populations focused in some big cities. Obviously, there's dispersed remote communities, but not the same way we have in the US. And so that makes it a challenge to get 4G and 5G built out to a high percentage of Americans, which is our goal. So this new decision that we're doing should help. We also had this Sprint T-Mobile decision where we allowed those two companies to merge. As part of that merger, we imposed a condition that required them to build out 5G to 99% of the US population. So we're attacking it on a lot of metrics. We also have a federal universal service program. This is a $10 billion a year, basically, fund that we use to support the build out of internet infrastructure in remote parts of the country where there's no private sector business case. So for us, the finish line isn't seeing the first 5G builds as we have seen in places like New York or San Francisco. It's about every single community in the US getting a fair shot. And so right now, places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota are live with 5G. And I think that's a much better measure of the progress that we're making in this country.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Maybe if I just may ask you one more question on this, is what is the balance between free trade and our privacy, consumers and businesses being worried about 5G coming from companies that might not adhere to the laws in the market they build technology, roll out technology, but in the country they're coming from? The elephant or dragon in the room here would be China.
Yeah, I agree. With my counterpart in Europe, that countries should purchase gear, or they should allow their private sector to purchase gear that represents the best possible deal. And when you make that calculus about what the best possible deal is, you have to consider the national security implications that go along with it. And when you add those considerations in, I think it supports the direction we've taken in the US, which is we've now prohibited this subsidized Huawei and ZTE gear from going into the US networks. Look, as we've talked about, 5G is not just about email and cat memes anymore. It is every single thing that we value. It is banking, it is health, all sorts of information, connected cars. If those 5G networks aren't secure, then nothing that we value is going to be secure. So we've taken concrete steps to keep that Huawei ZTE gear out. We've also looked at other entities that ultimately may be owned or controlled by the communist regime of China. We prohibited China Mobile, which is one of the largest telecom operators, mobile operators in the world, from entering and connecting to the US network based on national security concerns. And we are right now looking at whether we should revoke the existing authorization that allows China Telecom to be connected to the US network. That was an authorization that we issued 10 or 15 years ago under a very different situation. And so we were very actively looking at whether to revoke China Telecom's authorization. So I think particularly when you look at what's happened with the global spread of COVID and just the massive amount of misinformation that has come out of the communist regime on that, they actively misled the world. They are pushing out propaganda right now to cover their tracks and to further their own geopolitical agenda. I think all of that activity is relevant because it underscores the lengths to which the communist regime and entities that are under the communist regime's thumb are willing to go to protect Beijing. So I think all of that is consistent with the approach we've been taking in the US, which is look at the full value that happens when you have this gear in your network. And I think we've been seeing some good results. I think the UK recently has shown that they may be taking a little bit of a U-turn from their prior approach. I think that's welcome news. I think it's the right step.
Thank you. Matthias, what is currently the situation in Sweden? I could read in the news that Sweden aims already has closed the Confucius Institutes in Sweden, which are sort of being used by the Chinese Communist government to push their agenda is like on a soft cultural side. What is currently the situation in Sweden on 5G and allowing vendors from China to roll out the network?
Unfortunately, the Swedish socialist liberal government has been very naive when it comes to China, and Huawei is involved now in the launch of 5G in several parts of Sweden. Even though we have a Swedish company, Ericsson, who are leading in the front line of this development, and I think that goes to all different sectors. We had a report recently from the former military agency, intelligence agency in Sweden, the head of that showed that we actually helped the Chinese defense forces with Swedish taxpayers' money to develop their military technology. So we have allowed a lot of people from the Communist Red Army to come here and study at Swedish University and take the information and the technology back home. And in many other ways, we're also subsidizing this regime. And I think we are waking up to a new reality. And I think there has been some sharpening of the legislation, but we are lagging behind many other countries. And I think that's very unfortunate. It's just my party and other conservative parliamentarians who have been raising this issue, and I think the parties on the left in Sweden has been dangerously naive when it comes to this. But I hope that they will wake up and that we can. And I also need that we think that we need as much as possible a common Western strategy when it comes to these issues, because otherwise I think China will be able to play us out against each other, and that would be unfortunate.
Good. So we have also some time for Q&A. So we have about 2,000 participants here in this Zoom, but then we have more people following this conversation on different social media channels. So we can also encourage everyone just to submit questions either here in Zoom or on social media. I already collected a couple of questions. So I'm not sure, Commissioner Carr, Matthias, do you have any additional things you would like to convey before we go into Q&A?
No, that's okay.
I'm good.
Let's go to the questions.
Okay, so one question is potentially to both of you. We've already touched it, 5G and rural areas. So someone asks, how will 5G directly benefit internet access for rural and remote areas? Maybe just once more, but explain how 5G can improve the access. I think it's more like a technical explanation. Maybe Commissioner Carr.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, our finish line is 5G everywhere. And the technical challenge is this way. Think of spectrum as sort of a 3-layered cake. So the bottom layer is going to be your high-speed, wide area coverage layer. And that's going to be low-band spectrum. That's 600 megahertz, 700 megahertz spectrum. And there's a misconception that that's not where 5G is going to be deployed. That's not the case. 5G is going to be deployed on every spectrum band, including low band. So you're going to get this base high speed, better than 4G, 5G coverage across low band spectrum that you're going to serve a lot of rural communities with. And on top of that, you're going to have mid-band spectrum. And that mid-band spectrum is even higher speed, higher capacity. It propagates over smaller geographic areas. And therefore, you're going to use that to cover, main streets. You're going to use that to cover potentially, schools, other areas where there's going to be a bit more population density, including in rural communities. And then on top of all that, you're going to have this stack of what we call high band spectrum. And this is super high speed, fiber-like speeds. It doesn't propagate very far. And that's why you need to put a lot of these small cells around to distribute that high band spectrum. So that's how we conceive of it, is low band 5G for wide area rural coverage, mid band for sort of everything, and then that high band, what we call millimeter wave spectrum, to give you really that punch of fiber-like speeds. And then of course we got to make it economical to build everywhere. The more expensive it is to build somewhere, it's just like taxing it, you're going to get less of it. And so we've been pushing down the regulatory costs of building out internet infrastructure that's been pushing out the builds and flipping the business cases for thousands of communities, potentially where it wouldn't have been profitable. And now because we've eliminated some of the costs, it is profitable. So we're tackling it on a lot of different ways to make sure that 5G is not just a luxury of living in a high population density area.
There's one follow-up question to this. So one person asked, is it true that 5G needs more towers to work? Is that true?
Yes and no. So when you think about that base layer of 5G, that's going to look very similar from an infrastructure perspective as existing 3G and 4G cell sites. In fact, that's basically what we have today. But when you look at adding those mid-band spectrum and then adding the high-band spectrum on top of that, that's where you need to add more sites. But they're not going to be the 300-foot towers that you need for that base layer. These are going on utility poles, light poles, sides of buildings. So yeah, we need something like 100 times the number of cell sites that we have today to support 5G because of that mid-band and high-band spectrum that doesn't propagate so far. But it's not going to be, a 100-fold increase in the 200, 300-foot towers.
Thank you. I also really desperately need 5G over here. One question to Matthias. That's in the center of London. That ties a bit into probably the civil society buy-in we need, because a lot of my story, for instance, here is that a former neighbor has effectively lobbied against a new mobile phone antenna in our neighborhood, which would have been installed in an office building. Hence, we're struggling here with connectivity issues. And that's definitely something why we think at the Consumer Choice Center it's important to talk about 5G and also the technical aspects. Because often one person who doesn't want it can delay the process of rolling out such a technology or an antenna by years and years in a neighborhood, which puts just like hundreds of people in a disadvantage. This is probably something why it's really important to do so much marketing and explain the benefits of this. But more a geopolitical question to you, Matthias, would be what or how will Sweden, what would your opinion be how Sweden and a common Western strategy against China could work? What would it entail? How could the EU, Sweden, United States, Australia collaborate to have a joint response to Chinese approach and threat to consumer privacy and telecommunications?
I think that we should have a common strategy. The basis of it would be that we shouldn't allow China we shouldn't allow ourselves to be dependent on China when it comes to strategic infrastructure. No Western country should do that, because that will also put other Western countries at risk. And I also believe that we should have some pact of solidarity or something like that when China is blackmailing, trying to punish one of our nations, because they are like Australia now. They are looking for an independent investigation on the origin of COVID-19, and for that they are being punished with tariffs, and China is trying to hurt their economy. And because this goes also deeper than just economics and trade. We had a situation in Sweden where an organization of writers and journalists wanted to give an award to a Chinese dissident who have been fighting for democracy and human rights. And then immediately the Chinese ambassador in Sweden started to make threats using a very aggressive tone, and basically threatening Sweden with economical repercussions because of a free society, free organization who supports democracy wanted to give an award to someone. And if we allow ourselves to be too dependent on China in these matters, we will be more vulnerable to this kind of blackmail. And if we don't stand up together in the West, I think that in the end could pose a real danger to freedom and democracy in our civilization.
I'm pretty sure we go back to that topic once more, because we're getting quite a bit of questions about this in. But one more US-specific question to Commissioner Carr by Gary Bolton on he assumes that the US is deploying non-standalone 5G networks built upon the existing 4G infrastructure. So the question is, how can the US be successful in 5G and 5G applications without a robust fiber infrastructure, especially in rural communities? Apologies.
Well, you're right that we need both. We need high-speed wired connections, and we need high-speed wireless sites to make 5G work. And as I mentioned, that's where our policies are making a big difference. Last year, we had over 400,000 route miles of fiber built out in this country. That's enough to wrap around the globe 18 times, something like 6 or 7 million new homes, principally in rural communities, if I remember right, were newly passed with fiber last year. So we're seeing a big build out of high-speed fiber. I was just a few months ago before COVID in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, a very rural, very remote area that runs along the border of South Dakota and Nebraska. And I was with a fiber team there that was trenching, pulling conduit through miles and miles of some of the most sparsely densely populated areas. Finally got that right, in this country. And they're going to have basically every single premises on that reservation passed with fiber in the next couple of years, if I remember right. So we really get the need to have a tremendous amount of high-speed wired connections, and we're doing exactly that right now. And the U.S. is in really good shape. You know, we were at risk of falling behind China, our other global counterparts, particularly in 2015 and 2016, but we've now flipped the script, and on a per capita basis, are building out 5G on a scale, according to some estimates, even faster than what you're seeing in China, given the population base over which they need to build their network. So I'm really pleased with the progress the U.S. is making. No one's flying the mission accomplished banner flag at this point. We got work to do. We got to close the digital divide. There's still too many Americans, particularly in rural communities, that don't have this service, but it's a priority for us that we're focused on.
Question from me on this, actually, also a bit more technical, but isn't it easier to update infrastructure, not cheaper, but easier to update infrastructure in rural areas? Because I'm just like envisioning like a urban jungle like New York or Chicago, where it's probably much harder to put in new fiber cables and get permits for antennas, or is that actually fairly easy to do, even like in big, densely populated areas?
You know, we've been trying to put, sort of federal guardrails in place. So whether you're, building in New York or building in rural Montana, you're going to have roughly the same regulatory environment to deal with. It is more challenging in rural areas. The terrain can be difficult to deal with. And really the challenge there is just population density. You can have a router in Manhattan and you can spread the cost over, millions of people, and a router in rural Montana, you have 2 people to spread the cost over. So the economics are just so challenging when you look at rural communities. That's part of why we have this universal service fund to offset the cost of these rural builds.
We haven't talked much money yet, but what is usually the cost of setting up like one antenna?
Yeah, it's a good question. We are looking at it at a higher level. We have this 5G fund that providers can apply for. We've got, as I mentioned, this $10 billion universal service fund. And one of the interesting things when you think about the cost is they are actually dropping pretty quickly. Part of that is because 4G was really built out almost exclusively on bespoke pieces of hardware that in the past manufacturers based in China had a number of advantages in building for various reasons. But 5G is moving to what we call a virtualized network. So instead of having, multiple bespoke, expensive pieces of hardware, you have one dumber piece of hardware that's a cheaper piece of hardware that really anybody can build. And then the brains of the operation now are at the coding or the software level. So that dramatically reduces the cost of builds, but also adds security because US companies, European companies can compete on a level playing field when it comes to providing the coding and other software-based services. You don't need to have the slave labor that China takes advantage of to drive down their manufacturing costs. US companies, European companies can compete and invest in the build out of 5G that used to be manufacturers, but can now be done at a software level. So that's really significantly driving down the cost of 5G builds.
So, Matthias, do you think there is some potential for some public policy or regulatory knowledge sharing between the US best practice on 5G and Sweden?
I think this is an area where we need to cooperate closely and to learn from each other. And I think we also need, as I said, need in certain ways when it comes to security, look for a common strategy. But that goes, of course, also beyond security. I think I'm a firm believer in a closer transatlantic link and a closer cooperation between Western nations in general. And it certainly also goes for this area that I believe, as I said in the beginning, will be revolutionary to the way we organize society and to our infrastructure and to commerce and you know, the situation for consumers and businesses.
Great, thank you both very much. So we can see that there is agreement that 5G brings great opportunities, that we can really help to increase productivity. Probably that's going to be very much needed in the next couple of years, given this recession we're all currently walking through and sliding in. But at the same time, we need to be careful where technology comes from. And with that, I would like to give both of you the chance for like a final statement on your outlook and what do you think are the next action items and steps and policy, but also in the private sector to make sure 5G will be a success.
Well, I'll start. As I said, we're really excited about the progress that the private sector has made here. One third piece I want to touch on, I mentioned spectrum, I mentioned infrastructure. The third piece is workforce. We have to have the skilled workers in place to build out and complete this 5G build. Even before this COVID pandemic, the private sector could add 20,000 tower climbers alone in the US. And these are good paying jobs. They start at $60,000 a year US. Pretty quickly, you can move to over 100,000 as you work your way up the different opportunities in the tower industry. So I announced a jobs initiative a year or so ago that looks to community colleges. So you can take someone that has basically no skills, relevant skills coming into it, and through an 8 to 12 week community college program, which is very affordable, you can learn the mix of classroom and technical climbing skills to build out this network. We also need more workers on just the fiber side as well, the wired side. So that's an issue that I think policymakers need to keep in mind. It's a bit outside of my regulatory jurisdiction at the FCC, but I offered up this policy idea because I think it is key to making sure 5G is built out. Plus, again, with our economies right now, a lot of people need to get back to work quickly. So if your old job isn't there for you when you come out of lockdown, consider a job in this infrastructure field. Again, starting out solidly middle-class pay, a lot of room for upward mobility because these end up being small businesses. So you can work for a little bit, then start your own small tower infrastructure business. Very, very low barriers to entry in terms of what it takes, particularly if you find a community college or an infrastructure company willing to take you on in an apprentice capacity.
Thank you. Matthias, do you have some final words on 5G and the future of connectivity in Sweden and Europe?
Besides the things that I've been talking about almost the whole time about being careful and the situation with China and the need for sharper legislation in Sweden and part of Europe, I agree with the focus of Commissioner Carr as well. I think that the education system needs to be in step with the development here, and I think that's a responsibility on my part and as a politician to make sure that our students as soon as possible can get access to this, and that we also adopt our educational system so that we can as soon as possible tap into the benefits of this new technology and this new infrastructure. I also think artificial intelligence is something that is gonna grow exponentially on the basis of 5G, and I think that's an area where we need to also prepare society and look at different, how to prepare and adjust our laws and legislation and education system and the workplaces to fit with that new development, because I think this is going to be revolutionizing And even though I've sounded a bit wary during this discussion, I must say again that I'm very, very optimistic about this, and I think this is going to offer us great opportunity for growth and prosperity.
Thank you both so much. We as a Consumer Choice Center love innovation, and we love consumer choice, as our name says. So thank you both for carving out this hour out of your both very busy schedules. We're going to make sure to promote the content of this webinar for the next couple of weeks also on our social media channels, so more people learn about the advantages and smart policies around 5G. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening and asking questions. And thank you so much, Commissioner Carr and Matthias Karlsson.
Thanks for having us.